I'm Mark Fowler. I'm the Deputy CEO at the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. First, I just want to say that I encourage everyone, if you wouldn't mind, to actually turn your cameras on. It'll be a little bit of a different conversation if we can see one another. And so I would appreciate that for anyone who's comfortable doing that. Just in terms of, hey Jennifer, hi Chris, Jeremy, hi, welcome. I'm just looking at my notes here to keep myself honest. I wanted to start this conversation first by as we were preparing for this conversation, one of the things that became clear to me were the differences between the kinds of businesses that we serve and the kinds of businesses that exist. There are some of you who represent companies and organizations who are essential businesses at this point, given the work that you do and the products that you produce for society generally. And so I wanted to just thank all of you for all of the work that you are doing to maintain supply chains that allow people to get the things that they need. And then also recognizing that there are still great deals of changes that are taking place for companies that are not necessarily essential business services, and yet businesses still going on. So we just want to thank everyone for the work that they're doing. I also wanted to take a moment to just acknowledge anyone who may have a friend or a family member or loved one or community member who is directly being impacted by COVID-19. We just wanted to send you our thoughts and prayers that they will be well and that the community will continue to heal as we go through this pandemic together. Just a bit of housekeeping. I wanted you to know that we are recording this session, and as soon as we're able to download it and get it set up on our website, we will be making it available to the public and to all of our constituents, and would ask if you find the conversation to be valuable to share the link and information once it's made available. Just as way of introduction, I was fortunate enough, I guess almost 2 weeks ago now, to do a presentation for the conference board around navigating religious diversity in the workplace. And after the presentation, and I hope she doesn't mind me using her name, Juanita Erb from the Estee Lauder Companies reached out to ask us, what were we doing in terms of, or were there bodies of information we were planning to make available as in response directly to COVID-19. And we had been thinking about it and it hadn't quite gelled. And it occurred to me that, in thinking about what could we offer uniquely as Tanenbaum, I thought of this person who works with and for employees on a regular basis through their life journey and kind of critical life journey moments. And that person is Karen Diefendorf, who's joining us today. And I reached out to Karen and she immediately said yes and agreed to have this conversation with us. Karen is one of the most accomplished people I know, so we couldn't go through her whole bio. We don't have that kind of time. But I will say in brief that she is a person whose life has been guided by her faith from the time that she was a child, that after her ordination and direct service in religious and spiritual communities, she became an Army chaplain and served with the U.S. Army Chaplain Services for, I think, 24 years, if I remember that correctly, and has been working with Tyson Foods as the director of their chaplain services. And I don't remember how long, Karen, but you can tell us when we get you on board. But I'm just so honored to both have her as a colleague and a friend, and for her saying yes to this conversation today. So Karen, if you would unmute yourself. if you can, and let me know if you can, and I'll do it for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have some notes up, and so they're covering everything here.
No problem. We can see you perfectly. And for those who are participating, if you put us on speaker view, then when we speak, you'll actually be able to see us, and you won't have to hunt around and see where we are exactly. So Karen, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be having this conversation, be invited to do this. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome. I think one of the things that would be helpful for people to know, because I'm sure you've spoken with any number of companies over the years who were wanting to know what the Chaplain Services program was, what do you provide, how do you get one started? So could you just tell us first a little bit about the Tyson's chaplaincy program, and what are some of the things that you all work with on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So about 20 years ago, John Tyson acquired a company called Tyson Foods, and they had chaplains. So you know how mergers go. They're looking at comparable positions. We didn't, of course, have chaplains at that time, and so they got rid of all the chaplain positions. About 6 months later, I'm told John Tyson went through somewhat of his own spiritual experience and began to rethink that and thought, you know, maybe it would be a good thing to have chaplains. So he reached out to the former director of chaplains for the Tyson Foods family poultry business and began to incorporate a chaplaincy program. And the intent back then, the thought 20 years ago was, we'll just go into the local community where we have plants, predominantly poultry plants back then, and we'll use the yellow pages and we'll try to find some local clergy who maybe reflect culturally, ethnically, the demographics that we have in our plants. So John's idea was every chaplain ought to be part-time, because he didn't want people to think that, well, the chaplain is just one more management person that we're not sure we trust. As it's turned out now, 20 years later, 50% of our chaplains are full-time, because once our team members learned what a great benefit it was to have someone there that they could talk to about life and about their faith or about their belief systems, they wanted them there all the time. So our smaller plants still have part-time chaplains, but who have access to them if there was a crisis or a need. Those part-time chaplains still respond. Part of what we provide for, gosh, it's a myriad of things. So I just want you to think about life. On any given day, life comes with you wherever you are. So if you just got a phone call from the school principal that your child is going to be suspended for 3 days, tell me how that doesn't distract you at work. And then you're thinking about, what do I do with that child for 3 days at home, because I got to go to work. Life comes with us through the door, whether it's a parent being put in a nursing home, whatever it is. So our chaplains are there to help people first deal with their emotions. I think emotions become that window of our soul sometimes, and what we're thinking. I also know that what we think about what we're going through is probably more important than the event itself. I think we know that from just basic stress management principles, right? That what we think causes an awful lot of second and third order effects to take place physiologically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. So our chaplains are there somewhat, they look a little bit like a combination of pastoral care provider and social worker. They're there to help find resources, and they're there to be good counselors and help folks listen. So the way we recruit chaplains now is not taking the yellow pages, if I could find one, and going into a local community and trying to find a local pastor who would help us, but rather in this day and age, in the advertising world, in the HR arena, if we post a position, We post it looking for someone with a Master of Divinity degree. That is generally 90 postgraduate hours. So when we think masters, people usually think about 30, 36 hours. But a Master of Divinity is 90 postgraduate hours. We're looking for someone maybe who has also had some clinical pastoral education, a clinical residency in a hospital, for instance. But the whole purpose of CPE is to help our folks know themselves well so that we know how we get in our own way and to stay out of our own way and helping our team members. That's the long answer to what you asked.
And an important one, I think, because you hit on a couple of important points, both about the history of the chaplaincy program, but also the scope and depth of the kinds of services that you're providing to Tyson employees. I wanted to ask, and I think we talked about this a little bit in preparation for the conversation, if you're seeing any trends in terms of what are some of the issues now that chaplains are addressing with the workforce in the face of COVID-19 that may be a little bit either unique or nuanced given the circumstances we find ourselves in?
Well, first and foremost, life still goes on, no matter whether we have a virus in the country or not. So this morning, for instance, we had a conversation with one of our regional chaplain groups, and the conversation was around, look, right now, we don't make hospital visits, we don't go in to make home visits, and we are not permitted to go to the funeral home and make a pastoral call there. So right now, my chaplains are feeling, I won't say that their hands are tied, they're just having to find creative ways to do it. So if you're going to provide a funeral service, for instance, how do you do that nowadays? So does the family gather and practice social distancing, and the pastor come up on a screen like this, use Zoom, and do the eulogy and the sermon or the memorial service that way? How is it that we can be in contact with folks? So we're trying to be creative. We're trying not to bring additional possibilities of contamination into the workplace. And when you think about a factory, people are standing side by side, right? So social distancing is unreasonable given the work environment. So one of the things that I think we hear more from our team members is anxiousness about whether or not I'll get sick because my teammate went out last night and decided to hang out with folks and he doesn't know where they've been and maybe bring something into me. So one of the things we've started to do at many of our plants, I would say majority of our plants, is they're doing daily temperature taking. So you come in the door, before you can enter the workplace, we're going to take your temperature. I thought that might raise greater anxiety, but what I'm being told is that it's really helped team members to feel more assured that their peers are not sick and are not bringing things into the workplace. So yeah, everybody's trying to change up what we do and how we do it. For those of us that work in a corporate headquarters environment, we're using Zoom a lot. We're making phone calls. We're sending out emails to particular teams or groups of teams. And we're just all trying to be as creative as we know how to be.
Karen, you talked a little bit about, you started talking about the communication aspect. And I think you had said that there were communications specifically coming from the chaplaincy to the workforce. I wondered if you could just say a little bit about how your communications have shifted at all, or at least what are you focusing on communicating to your workforce?
Yeah, we're trying to meet whatever the need is as it bubbles up to the surface. So every day you kind of stir like in chemistry class, you stir the solution and whatever comes to the top, you scrape off and try to deal with, right? One of the things one of our chaplains did was she made about a 1.5 minute little video clip about how do you find inner peace. And it was wonderful. She was standing out under a tree outside. She talked about you take a walk, what parts of who you are, your beliefs, your spirituality are you engaging right now? And just a reminder that that's an okay thing to do. We're reminding our team members that boundaries are important right now, not just physical boundaries, but if you're working from home, all of us need to have a good start time and an end time. I am amazed now at how many extra emails I'm getting well past what would be normal kind of cease time, right? I know we're all trying to respond, we're trying to think of things, but having good boundaries on when we begin our workday and when we end it is an appropriate and okay thing to do. Sometimes we just have to give ourselves permission to do that. I've put together a stress management piece along with a couple of our other chaplains. We've done some things for our Europe team by Zoom, and just as a way of saying, look, we know that you know these principles, but here's a reminder of what they look like.
That's great. And, I would really love if you could, we had a really interesting conversation about the difference between, or at least the experience, the interaction between one's personal experience of culture and what's culturally appropriate, what is then, kind of how does that mesh with a corporate culture, or how does that mesh with this new culture that we find ourselves in some instances working remotely and or distanced from people. So could you give us a little bit of that refresher in terms of those stress management ideas that we should keep top of mind?
Yeah, Tyson has a lot of immigrant employees that represent, I think the last word I heard was something like 52 different languages spoken in our across our company. So that, first, it's a monumental task just to translate anything you put into writing. Secondly, if a plant manager is going to communicate with all of those team members at a full plant team meeting, you have to have multiple translators there to help in that facility. So, and culture brings its own nuances to how we deal with crisis. So in some cultures, perhaps if there is a crisis, maybe the way that culture deals with it is we just don't talk about it. So you demonstrate strength by being silent. So the more we talk about it, the more they wonder if we are weak, right? There may be another culture in which the need for physical expression becomes all the greater. And here we are practicing, don't get near me. One of my chaplains called to share some things and said, oh my goodness, I'm being bear hugged in the place. And very much cultural need for that reassurance, and the chaplains representing this very non-anxious presence. This chaplain happens to be a little bit older, so I think there's also that sense of reverence for my elder and this need to greet them in this very personal way. So you're just trying to communicate to folks every way you can, and even when you do it, you're not sure that it's fully understood, and I think that can sometimes be a little frustrating and disconcerting to folks.
I had to unmute myself. One of the things we also talked about was this idea and kind of the idea of managing what someone's experience is of what's really true, and how to manage encounters, whether they're through Zoom or in person, if you're still working in an essential workplace. In terms of stress management, that whole idea of what causes me stress and what do I believe to be fully true versus what's fully true. Yeah. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I was saying, I'm sure it's not new with me or original with me, and it is that what we believe about something is probably more powerful than the event itself. So I'm a pretty good cognitive behavioralist. I think that you have these events that take place, generally speaking, over which you have no control. You have no real input as an hourly worker as to whether or not we're going to run the plant or we're not going to run the plant, right? You just know you have a job, and if you want to keep your job, you got to come to work. So you have these events, and those events create what I refer to as our barometer going off. Our emotions are really a barometer. We have to remember that sometimes our emotions can even lie to us. All they are is a response to what happened and what we expected to have happened. So what I believe about it is really the only thing over which I have substantial control. So helping me to understand truths in the midst of what I'm thinking or concluding is pretty important. We've all heard that phrase about, well, that's just a half truth. I'd like to flip that a little bit and say, well, no, maybe it's a half lie. Because if something's only half true, there's a half falsehood with it, or at least something that's twisted just ever so slightly. So if I am able to confront the lie part or the irrational part of what I'm thinking, I am able to then create a better sense of calm and peace over what I'm going through. Rational emotive therapy talks about activating events and then the beliefs that we have. And the beliefs, generally speaking, initially, in that split second, tend to be very rational. Oh my cow, this doesn't feel good, right? We express a worry or a thought. But it doesn't take long before we begin to say words that are what in that discipline would call it an irrational belief. Now, they're not calling the person irrational, but they're saying that the belief isn't quite fully true. So I find 6 words that help me to identify when I'm having beliefs that are more on the irrational side than the rational. And so here are the 6 words. Should, ought, if only. I realize that's 2 words, but you got to go with me here, folks. Should, ought, if only, always, never, and but. If I hear myself using those words on myself or others, it probably should be a red flag that I ought to stop and just identify, is that really fully true? Am I always a grump? No, I'm not. Am I, if I would have done this, then I wouldn't be in this place. Well, that might be partially true, but there may be some falsehoods attached to it. You understand what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I think that's so useful about what you're sharing is that, you know, we're in the midst of a global health crisis where literally day by day, information is upgraded, is shared, sometimes shared prematurely or not fully. And I do think that having these 6 words in terms of managing our own individual stress, and perhaps just being mindful of, if I hear these words coming from a colleague, noting that they are experiencing some kind of stress perhaps as well. So that can guide our interactions with one another.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's important that we have the freedom to say to our friends and colleagues in the workplace, oh, wait a minute, is that really accurate? And we all need to have a check buddy.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have some technology that we've been using around that in terms of respectful communications and really checking in around stereotypes, because this can be the breeding ground. The same kind of behavior, if not in the face of COVID-19, would be some of the instruction we might give around interacting with someone who's different from you and being able to debunk stereotypes that you may hold, but also that you might hear about a colleague because of some aspect of their identity.
Yes.
So let me pivot a little bit. I did want to ask, we had this conversation about, and you mentioned this a little bit, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about it in terms of like, what are, you know, there are activities that the chaplaincy corps would have normally engaged with, and how to support employees in not experiencing themselves as victims. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think just simply good counseling practice as we talk to team members about their anxiety. One of the most important things we can do, remember I talked about these events over which we have no control. So one of the things that creates additional stress is having more things that over which we have no control. So helping to empower our team members to take control over what they do have control over. They do have control over a commitment they're going to make to their coworkers around them, that they are going to practice safe interactions with other people, that they, in spite of how boring it may be, they are going to choose to go home from work and maybe put themselves on a daily kind of quarantine so that they don't expose themselves and then bring it into the workplace the next day. But that requires a choice. And if we express that choice in terms of a commitment to one another, that this is good for all of us, universalist ethics would say that we need to practice those kind of choices. But it's been a long time since the United States has literally had to come together as a nation and as a people to practice choices that limit our own freedom. We don't like that as Americans very well. So it's now time for us to step up to the plate and do some things like that. So that empowers our team members to make a choice that's good for them and good for others. And we want to couch it in terms of community. If ever there was a time for Tyson Foods to practice its 5 C's, one of those 5 C's happens to be caring, it's now. And so we try to communicate that and repeat that and remind people, for me, out of my own theology of work, that work is a God-given thing and that they are on the front lines taking a risk every day with their own lives and their own health in order to provide food for the world. Wow, that is a really big mission and a huge understanding of what it means to work in the kingdom of God.
I mean, there are a couple of really great nuggets out of what you're sharing just now. So one is definitely that your company's core mission and values that you've already expressed, this is an opportunity to really look and see what is there to communicate anew or ongoingly that applies to the experiences that people are having. You know, something around caring and belonging and having those be the context for the ways in which we're asking people to interact with one another, to respect boundaries of time if you've all moved to working remotely and all of those kinds of things. I think that that's so important. And I you know, when we talked about this, I hadn't thought about the different kinds of businesses. And that is a big goal in terms of providing food to the world in the midst of a pandemic and acknowledging what people are actually putting at stake, that it is not just business as usual, but in some instances, depending on your industry, you are asking people to take a risk for both the fulfillment of the values or mission that you have, but also because you're providing a vital service that's necessary for society to continue to function. So those are really, really good nuggets. So thank you for that.
Well, I think one of the things I learned as a hospice chaplain and even as a military chaplain is that when we face the end of our days, we all want to know that our life had meaning and purpose, right? And gosh, this is a great time for, I think, all of our chaplains to remind people that whatever their belief system is, there is great meaning and purpose in this.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I think it would be a good time now for us to pause and maybe take some questions from all of you who are joining us today. If there is a feature, if you click on the participants box at the bottom of your screen, there is a feature that allows you to raise your hand and I'll be able to call on you and then unmute you so that you can ask your question to Karen. So if you have a question, please just touch the feature that says raise hand, and I'm happy to get your question into the conversation. Donna, please, and I'll unmute you. In one moment. You should be unmuted, or you may have to do it yourself, Donna.
Okay. Hi, Karen, can you hear me?
I can.
Great information so far. I wonder, like, what advice would you give us for those people who are working from home, and especially for those who are isolated, like who maybe don't have spouses or children, who are really alone. I'm trying to check in with people, like have Skype conversations, maybe like voice to voice, not just texting Skype, but I actually just like voice to voice conversations. But what other advice could you give us to try to kind of keep those people encouraged, because they are, really, really isolated right now?
So we are having a conversation ourselves at the company about some of those very things that you're talking about. We are tossing around the idea of maybe just some various community groups, just fun things to do. So maybe at 5 o'clock, I know of one company that's doing like a 5 o'clock happy hour, maybe a couple of times a week, and everybody gets on Zoom, and we know it costs bandwidth, but in that group, and that's going to do that, they want to see faces, and everybody can have their beverage of choice, a bottle of water to champagne if they want. But it's a time where they're not going to talk about work. It's a time where they're going to just talk about what life's like. Even for people who are isolated right now and home alone, I don't know what they normally would do for stress, but I know that for me, one of my stress relievers is just to get in the car and take a drive. So today it's sunshiny in Arkansas, and I am probably tonight, when I'm finished with dinner, get in the car and take just a short drive. It doesn't expose me to anybody or me to them, or them to me. And so I can do that. I can get out taking a walk. You still have to make that choice when you live alone, not to think that there's nothing you can do. So any of the practices that help with stress management are important. So making a phone call, doing a visual thing, Donna, will be helpful. I don't have a full answer to this. We're just exploring how do we take better care of our folks. I'm happy. I'm alone myself right now. My husband works in Texarkana, Texas. So he only comes home every other weekend. So I understand what that isolation feels like. And as the consummate extrovert that I am, this is really hard. This is very hard.
Yeah. Thank you. That's good.
Thanks, Donna. Jennifer, London, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to both of you for hosting this event today. I had a question, sort of a clarifying question about the chaplain program, and then sort of a follow-up regarding current situation. Does the chaplaincy program run across multiple faiths? You mentioned that it reflects the diversity of your employees based on region. So if that's the case, how are you seeing the differences across faiths as it relates to this current, this current crisis, and also for people who may not be attached to one particular faith?
Sure. Yes, so I try to speak in terms of belief systems, because when I talk about faith, most people immediately assume it has to be a religious conversation. So we'll work with folks that come from a lot of times an agnostic perspective or a humanistic perspective. So when we're having conversations with our team members that come from all sorts of backgrounds and philosophies and perspectives, chaplains are trained to listen closely to those interpretations. I often just ask point blank, tell me how your beliefs help you cope with what you're going through. Tell me how your beliefs right now aren't very helpful. I used to think nobody'd ever answered the second question, but I'm amazed at the door that opens, because sometimes when we go through things, we realize that whatever belief system we have, it's not helping us to sort things through. our chaplains are trained because the majority of them are clergy. Well, they're all clergy. They are listening for peculiarly religious language. So I may have somebody that talks about what they're going through in terms of God's purpose. Another person hears that word and they believe that means that God intentionally is causing this, so it's cause and effect for them. That would not be a very helpful concept for that person. So it's a matter of listening to whatever framework, worldview, whatever term you want to use, helps that person to make sense out of what is going on. Once I find out what helps that person make sense out of this, then that helps us to know what behaviors may follow. For some of our folks, there are rituals. Some of those are religious rituals. It might be prayer, reading whatever holy book they have. It may be for some the practice of yoga and trying to find a sense of a centered breathing that helps them to feel less stressed. So we're working across that gamut for sure. And our chaplaincy is trained to deal with any and all perspectives. It's not about me. It's not about our chaplains. It's about you, our team member. Does that help? Okay. All right, good.
I just want to highlight a couple of things that I've seen in the chat box while we're waiting for additional questions. Karen, thank you so much for sharing. Certainly condolences on the passing of your companion, your dog, but Karen shared that she was able to borrow one of her brother's dogs for companionship during this particular time. So I think bearing in mind, going back to that conversation of what do people know that they need, sometimes it's just giving them a space to actually say what it is that they need before we actually, try and get to helping them.
Well, that's a different Karen than me, Mark.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, Karen Jacobs. Yes, thank you.
Well, there's nothing worse than losing our pups.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And Tariq, you were sharing that we're getting close to Passover, Easter, and Ramadan, which tend to be faith activities that revolve around large gatherings. What are folks thinking a company's role should be in helping to meet this need for connection to community while we have remote workforces?
Well, one of the things that one of my chaplains that works directly for me is doing is she is in the process of building PowerPoint table tents. Had we been at the corporate headquarters, these would have been on the cafeteria tables, but they talk about first what each of these major religious holidays center around. So for instance, for Ramadan is not, we think about it as 30 days of fasting, but the purpose of that fasting is a celebration of God's forgiveness in our lives. I think that all of the Abrahamic faiths can understand that and its importance for all three of our faiths. Easter has that commonality of the cross being what allows us that forgiveness. Passover is the understanding of God delivering his people. So we want first for these PowerPoints that we're going to send out to all of our team members to be one, educational, so that in education we understand each other better. But we also want to remind people that their various places of faith are going to provide services, and most places of faith I'm seeing, as you are across Facebook and other social media, churches, synagogues, the mosques are doing a great job of providing Zoom conference kinds of things where people can join the service that way. As far as people in the plant or in our companies being joined together, another thing we've done is we have April's interfaith calendar, and we made a matching thing. So it says, we'll just say Easter, And then, you know, remember those little matching things we used to do in grade school? They can draw a line over to the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Whatever it is. On the back side of that crossword or matching game are all of the dates for the interfaith calendar. Those then have a useful tool, particularly for our HR folks, our sales folks, in remembering, oh yeah, when I make that international phone call, nobody's going to be connected to me because this is a required observance day for this particular faith community and is probably going on in that particular country. So we want it to be fun. We'll do a crossword puzzle next month. We'll do some other kinds of things. I think we have 4 different ways we try to use the interfaith calendar and just give people that information in a fun way.
Thanks, Karen. I wanted to remind everyone on our website, we also have holiday fact sheets that actually went out a little while ago for Passover and Easter. And I believe, Sujata, we also sent out for Ramadan or plan to do it shortly. We try to send those out 6 to 8 weeks before the actual celebration of the holiday. And those are a free download. So there's additional information there as well. And one of the things that I think can be helpful during this time is also to share what you're seeing, or maybe ask employees who are addressing these issues, because they're members of either religious or spiritual or ethical communities, to perhaps share the things that their communities are doing to stay connected, so that it doesn't have to just be a top-down communication, but it can certainly also be a sharing within the workforce around how people are managing during this time.
We had a downside. That's a really good point, Mark, if I can address that just for a minute. We had a downsizing in one of our work areas about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And we have probably 200 or 300 of our team members that know that they have 90 days from the date of that notification, their position will end. And so this group reached out and said, how can we as a group have a meeting place? So we put up a Teams site that they can email encouragement back and forth to each other. But once a week, they've decided that they want to begin their day on that Monday with a devotional and a time of prayer. And so anyone is invited to participate. It's not required. It's just offered as there. So those kind of things become helpful too in the process.
Thanks so much, Karen. Ivy Latimer, so good to see you. And I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Nice to see you as well. Thank you so much. And thank you, Karen, for this just terrific presentation. Very curious to learn more just from where you sit and your level of expertise and the connections you've made over the years. Where are you seeing this job role of a chaplain grow or trend across industries or business sectors? So many of us lead very large, large employee populations, and just where are you seeing that? I would suspect the airlines, I think I've heard of, certainly the food services as you were describing, but are we seeing this grow broadly across business sectors in terms of a bona fide role?
Yes, and I'm going to make a prediction that in the next 10 years, this will not be as unique as it is now. And companies have for the last probably 20 years been utilizing a chaplain service predominantly through 2 companies if they don't have their own. So the 2 big players that would contract chaplain services to a company are Corporate Chaplains of America and Marketplace Ministries. I will tell you that both of them are Christian faith-based companies, so they're not going to hire chaplains who come from other faith traditions. If you own your own chaplain service, you can choose to hire a Buddhist chaplain, a Muslim chaplain, Hindu, whatever you choose to do. But chaplaincy as a whole has come out of the Christian faith stream. So it's understandable that you might not find a lot of folks that come from other faith traditions. You also have to be a person, if you're going to be a chaplain, that understands that you work in a pluralistic environment and that it's not about you representing your particular faith or brand, but it is about the conversation starting with others and walking along beside them. So for many clergy, that is very uncomfortable because they, no matter what their faith tradition, could be Muslim or Christian or Buddhist or whatever, there's a sense that this is what I believe, and gosh, if I don't talk to you about what I believe, I'm somehow violating my own faith or integrity. So I think it takes a person who understands and feels comfortable with navigating this very pluralistic turf. But more and more, you're going to find people who have gone through theological education, have that Master of Divinity and its equivalent. More and more seminaries are offering chaplaincy tracks, not just a theology track or a counseling track. They're offering a chaplaincy track for that Master of Divinity. There are other theological perspectives, world religions that offer theological education that would be similar. And so we're going to see more and more of this, I think. But Corporate Chaplaincy of America and Marketplace Ministries together, I think, probably have something close to 3,000 chaplains that are serving little companies to big companies to office buildings, wherever people want that kind of services across the nation. So this is going to get bigger.
Thank you so much. Very helpful. And I'm just thinking, as a part of supplemental information, if we could get a copy of a job description, that would be great. I don't know if that's something that your firm can provide, or just again for companies that are interested. Thank you.
Absolutely. Mark and I can figure out how to get that to you.
We sure can. Also, Monica Diaz, you had a question, please, and if you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, I did. Hi there. How are you, Mark? Hi, Karen, and everybody. Thank you for this conversation. It's very timely and very appropriate. So, Karen, we have spoken in the past based on my curiosity for the topic that you bring. But the question that I have for you now is, considering that other companies are more leaning into more of the wellness and well-being aspects of taking care of the spirituality of the employees, right? Sometimes it's about, having meditation, yoga, mindfulness. I mean, it's almost like an evolution of where the care for spirituality is coming. Some companies may not still want to talk too much about the word spirituality, but you see where they're going, right?
Yes.
So how would you describe the, aside from having the degree, right, the divinity degrees and the clinical experience, in the practice of delivering the service of the chaplain, how would you describe are the major differences between your services and those of companies that are still in that route of mindfulness, well-being, meditation, stuff like that?
I think it's just a matter of a different experience base, perhaps. So wellness, mindfulness may be more rooted in a philosophy of humanity than it is the religious side. So chaplaincy would definitely be coming out of a religious perspective of things, where I think companies that have decided, gee, we're cautious about talking about religion in the workplace. We don't want to feud or fight or bad blood. Would tend to think that if they go to mindfulness or wellness or those kinds of topics, it sounds and feels a little more cultural or humanistic. And yet humanism is certainly, some would argue, a theological discipline. right? So I think when it comes to those things, it's a matter of preference, and the company maybe feeling like we're not quite ready to explore full-blown spiritual and religious topics in the workplace. And yet we still have to accommodate religious practices out there in the workplace, right? So I don't know if that's a helpful response or not. I haven't thought about those other companies and that wellness side too much.
I wanted to add something, Karen, to what you're offering, because Monica, for me, and I really like the way, Karen, that you kind of laid it out, because there is a perception about particular kinds of practices, and that if they're not part of the Abrahamic faiths, meaning some aspect of Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, then it's more approachable, and that it's not as religious, because the expression of it may be different, but the deep meaning to a person who practices that tradition is no different than someone who practices one of the larger faith traditions in the world. We had, at one point, we're advising a company around quiet rooms, and they were they very much wanted to call them prayer rooms. And our recommendation was to call them quiet rooms or serenity rooms, because that would communicate to people that the room was available to people of all faiths and spiritual practices, as well as to those who had no particular religious expression but might need a moment to kind of collect themselves or meditate. And it was a bit of a back and forth, because for some of the people that were on this committee, they only saw prayer through particular faith traditions. And they didn't understand, for instance, that yoga is not just a physical thing that you do in a studio in your neighborhood, but that it is an, thousands of years practice of connecting with the divine in that way. So I think one of the things I'm glad about the work we do at Tanenbaum is just education broadly around the foundation of traditions, but what are important issues to people, what are important components of their practice, whether it's part of a larger, more well-known tradition or one that might be smaller. There's one other question in the chat box, and I think this may be our last question for our time together. This is from Kira McDonald, who asks, who sends her many thanks, Karen, for the presentation. And I think you spoke a little bit about this, but she's asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on how the role of a chaplain is different from the role of a workplace counselor. Is it uniquely the spirituality element? And maybe throw something in there about employee assistance programs, because I think that might be where we would normally see that kind of engagement.
Yeah. So I'll start with the employee assistance program. Chaplains in our plants certainly use EAP as a resource, but they are not constrained by EAP. Secondly, our chaplains have a lot more time to chase down those resources than our HR folks do, who are just trying to stay above the flood of paperwork that now covers their desks on a daily basis. But EAP provides counseling services. Sometimes they're helpful at connecting our folks out there in the local community to a local counselor. I've had various experiences across the board with that. Some of our chaplains have degrees in what we call pastoral counseling. Probably the big difference in chaplaincy and a counseling service is that there would be many counselors that would not want to address religious beliefs, right? It's almost like, well, wait a minute, you need to talk to your pastor, your rabbi, your imam, or your spiritual guide, whomever it might be. That's we are glad to know that that's helpful to you or whatever, but they would not, many counselors just don't feel comfortable engaging in religious conversation. I have a Master of Divinity in Pastoral Care and Counseling and a Master's in Sacred Theology and Ethics. And I find the two blend very well because it's about how people are reasoning through whatever is going on in their life and then making choices about that. So no, I don't hold credentials where I'm going to make a diagnosis. So that may be a difference. Because of that, I often find that team members are more comfortable coming because they know I'm not trying to diagnose them. They think about going to see the counselor as a person who may tell them something's wrong with you. Is that the counselor's role? No, but there's certainly concerns that way. The other great part about being a chaplain is whatever those team members say to me is confidential. Unless it crosses two boundaries, and that is, are they going to harm themselves or others? Or are they doing something or know of something that they're bringing to me that may put the company at risk? And we tell them those things up front. But otherwise, whatever they say to me is confidential. And the HR or plant manager does not have a right to it.
Thank you so much, Karen. So we got two questions I'm going to try and get in. One may be a quick
I'll try to be
answer.
brief.
All right. So the first one is from Jeremy, who wanted to know if the chaplaincy program sits under HR, is within the HR department at Tyson Foods.
It does. It sits under the HR department at Tyson.
Okay, great. And so this will be actually our last question. This is a follow-up question from Kira McDonald. She wanted to know if you could just give us a quick overview of the typical day in the life of a chaplain.
Well, I will tell you, a plant chaplain, they're probably going to walk in the door, go by the plant manager's office, the HR manager's office, the nurse's office to see, did something happen today, the night before, is there anything going on? So they're going to check with key people to see, has something happened since I was last in the door here? And that helps them to know, do I need to go to the hospital? Or do I need to put on my protective gear and I'm going to go out on the floor? So the next stop, maybe after they go to their office and drop off their briefcase or whatever, maybe check their email, they're going to get ready and they're going to go out on the floor. And they're going to just up and down those production lines. And we know that a lot of times people are busy, so maybe I'm doing the thumbs up, thumb sideways, thumb down kind of experience where people on the line, if I know I've had a conversation with them a few days ago, I want to know how you doing. If they give me the thumb sideways or the thumb down, for sure, I'm going to meet them in the break room at break. So I may stop by that supervisor's station. I may take a walk to other locations within the plant, out in distribution, out to the trucking side. So those chaplains are going to do a walkthrough so people know they're there, know they're available, and can just get a feel for what's going on that day.
That's great and perfectly timed. So first,
I'm never brief, but I can hurry.
So Karen, first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. This has been a really, really rich conversation. I know I've learned from it. There's been lots of information in the chat box about the value that this has been providing to people. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. As I mentioned before, the recording will be available as soon as we're able to download it from Zoom and get it up on our website. Please certainly reach out to our team to let us know if there's anything else that we can provide for you, and stay safe as you can. And we'll continue to provide programming as we get through all of this together. So thank you everyone so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Mark.